Sylvie Reynolds barely had time to process what had just happened. One moment, she had been leaving the grand charity gala, her arms full of the silent auction gift basket she had won, and the next, she had grabbed the wrong coat from the coat check. She only realized her mistake when she stepped out into the frosty night air and slid her arms into the sleeves far too broad, far too expensive, and definitely not hers. "Oh no," she muttered, glancing back at the towering glass building behind her. The event had been held in one of the most exclusive venues in the city, and if the coat was any indication, it belonged to someone with serious money. The fabric was thick, warm, and lined with cashmere. A faint, intoxicating scent of cedar and something distinctly masculine clung to it. She should go back inside and return it, but her apartment was only a few blocks away, and the idea of standing in line again at the coat check made her groan. She'd return it first thing in the morning. No harm done. What Sylvie didn't know was that the coat belonged to Yaron Lancaster, the CEO of Lancaster Industries, one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in the city, and he was already looking for it. Yaron stood at the coat check, his patience wearing thin. "You lost it?" His sharp tone made the attendant flinch. "And not lost, sir. It seems someone took the wrong coat by accident." Yaron exhaled, rubbing his jaw. He didn't care about the coat, it was just a piece of clothing. But inside the inner pocket was something far more valuable, his grandmother's ring, the only thing he had left of her. "Find out who took it," he ordered, his voice low. "We're checking the guest list now," the attendant stammered. Yaron had no time to waste. He turned on his heel, already making his way toward the exit. Whoever had taken his coat had no idea what they were holding. The next morning, Sylvie rushed into Lancaster Industries' skyscraper, the coat draped over her arm. She had looked up the company name on the label inside the coat and realized it belonged to someone important, someone intimidating. The receptionist eyed her curiously. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but I think I accidentally took Mr. Lancaster's coat last night." The woman's eyes widened slightly before quickly dialing an extension. Within seconds, a deep, commanding voice responded on the other end. "Send her up." Sylvie swallowed hard as the elevator doors closed behind her. She wasn't usually nervous, but something about this felt intense. When she stepped into Yaron Lancaster's office, she felt the full weight of his presence before he even spoke. He stood behind a sleek, massive desk, his piercing dark eyes locking onto her. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a sharp suit that probably cost more than her entire rent for the year. "You're the one who took my coat," he said, his tone unreadable. Sylvie nodded quickly, stepping forward. "I'm so sorry, it was an accident, I swear." She placed the coat on his desk. "I didn't realize until I got home." He didn't move, just studied her with an intensity that made her shift on her feet. "And did you find anything inside?" Her brows furrowed. "Inside?" "A ring," he said, his voice clipped. "It was in the inside pocket." Sylvie's stomach dropped. She hadn't checked the pockets. She hesitated, guilt washing over her. "I didn't see anything, but I'll check my apartment. If it fell out, I'll find it." For the first time since she walked in, Yaron's expression shifted. He studied her, as if trying to read her sincerity. And then, something unexpected happened. He glanced at her smile. It was warm, completely unguarded, so unlike the world he was used to. For a brief moment, Yaron Lancaster, ruthless and composed, felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest. "Fine," he said. "You have 24 hours. Sylvie let out a breath. "I'll find it, I promise." As she turned to leave, Yaron found himself watching her go, something about her presence lingering in the air long after she was gone. He didn't know it yet, but that accidental mix-up was about to change everything. Sylvie hurried home, her pulse racing as she tore through her apartment, searching every possible place the ring could have fallen. She overturned cushions, checked every pocket of her own coat, and even crawled under her bed, but there was no sign of it. Panic curled in her chest. She had promised Yaron Lancaster she would find it, and she couldn't let him down. It wasn't just any piece of jewelry, it clearly meant something to him. By the time she stood amidst the chaos of her small apartment, her hands gripping the back of her chair for support, an uneasy realization settled in. If the ring wasn't here, then where had it gone? Her mind raced through the possibilities. She had walked home from the gala, taken the stairs instead of the elevator, and stopped at the corner store for a late-night snack. If it had fallen out anywhere along the way, she had to retrace her steps. Throwing on her coat, she rushed out the door, her boots clicking against the pavement. The morning air was crisp, a chilly breeze nipping at her cheeks as she hurried down the same path she had taken last night. At the corner store, she pushed inside and approached the clerk, an older man who barely glanced up from his newspaper. "Excuse me," she said, breathless. "Did anyone turn in a ring, a small one, gold band, maybe with a stone?" The man shook his head. "Haven't seen anything like that." Her stomach tightened, but she forced herself to remain calm. Thanking him, she stepped outside once more, her gaze sweeping the sidewalk. If she didn't find it soon, she would have to go back and face Yaren with empty hands. The thought sent a shiver through her, and not from the cold. Yaren sat in his office, fingers tapping against his desk. He wasn't used to waiting. In his world, when he wanted something, it was handled immediately. Yet here he was, relying on a stranger, a woman with a bright, effortless smile, to find something irreplaceable. He didn't trust easily. Life had taught him that much. But there had been something about the way Sylvie had promised to return the ring, the unwavering determination in her eyes, that made him pause. A knock at his door pulled him from his thoughts. His assistant stepped inside, holding a file. "Sir, your afternoon meeting is, reschedule it," he said without hesitation. The assistant blinked but nodded, stepping back out. Yaren leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. He hated the feeling creeping in, the uncertainty, the vulnerability of placing his faith in someone he barely knew. But for the first time in a long while, he had no other choice. Sylvie stood on the sidewalk, her heart hammering as she crouched near a drainage grate. A glint of metal caught her eye, barely visible between the slats. Holding her breath, she reached down, fingers stretching as far as they could go. The ring was just out of reach, her pulse pounded. She needed something, anything, to pull it closer. Spying a discarded straw near the curb, she grabbed it, bending it carefully before sliding it between the slats. With painstaking precision, she nudged the ring toward her fingertips. It felt like an eternity, but finally, the cool metal brushed against her skin. Holding her breath, she pinched it between her fingers and pulled it free. Relief flooded her as she stood, clutching the small band in her palm. She had it. Now she just had to return it. Yaren was staring out the window when his office door opened. He turned, his gaze landing on Sylvie as she stepped inside, slightly breathless, her cheeks flushed from the cold or the rush to get here. Without hesitation, she walked up to his desk, opening her palm. The ring sat there, gleaming softly in the office light. "I found it," she said, her voice carrying the same quiet determination as before. Something unfamiliar settled in Yaren's chest. He hadn't expected her to succeed. People made promises all the time, few followed through. Yet here she was. He reached out, taking the ring carefully from her palm, his fingers brushing against hers for the briefest moment. Warmth lingered. "You actually found it," he said, studying her. Sylvie lifted her chin. "I told you I would." He shouldn't have been impressed, but he was. Slipping the ring into his pocket, he regarded her carefully. "I owe you a favor," she laughed, the sound light. "You don't owe me anything, just take better care of your coat next time." Something about her response made his lips twitch, almost like the ghost of a smile. "Fair enough," he said. She turned to go, but something in him resisted the idea of her leaving so soon. "Wait," he said before he could stop himself. She paused, glancing back. Yes. He didn't know why he said it. But for the first time in a long time, Yaren Lancaster found himself wanting to prolong a conversation. And that was something he hadn't expected at all. Yaren had no idea why he was still standing there, watching Sylvie as if she had somehow disrupted the very foundation of his carefully structured world. He had the ring back. That should have been the end of it. But there was something about her, something refreshingly unpolished, untouched by the pretense he was so accustomed to, that made him reluctant to let her walk away. He never indulged in unnecessary interaction. His time was valuable, his schedule tightly controlled, and he never entertained distractions. But as Sylvie turned toward the door, something in him rebelled against letting her disappear so easily. "Have dinner with me," he said, the words leaving his mouth before he had fully considered them. Sylvie hesitated, turning back toward him with a look of mild surprise. "Dinner?" His tone remained composed, as if he hadn't just broken his own unspoken rule about keeping his personal life separate from unplanned encounters. "A simple meal. Consider it a token of appreciation for finding the ring." She studied him for a long moment, as if weighing whether to accept. He could see the hesitation flicker in her expression. "You don't owe me anything," she reminded him. "I know," he said, his voice even, "but I'd like to." For a beat, silence stretched between them. Then, to his surprise, she nodded. "All right, dinner." He didn't question the flicker of satisfaction that coursed through him at her agreement. Instead, he reached for his phone and made a brief call to ensure a reservation was arranged. Sylvie, however, seemed entirely unfazed by the luxury that surrounded them. If she had any nerves about dining with a man whose name was synonymous with power and wealth, she didn't show it. The restaurant was one of his favorites, a place that required reservations weeks in advance. They were escorted to a private table near the grand windows overlooking the city skyline. The atmosphere was intimate yet refined, the soft murmur of conversation blending with the faint melody of a live pianist in the background. Sylvie glanced around before settling into her seat. "You don't do casual, do you?" she observed, amusement lacing her tone. Yaron arched a brow. "Casual," she gestured subtly to their surroundings. "This is probably the most exclusive restaurant in the city." He leaned back, regarding her with measured curiosity. "Would you have preferred a diner?" She tilted her head, considering. "Honestly, fancy places make me nervous. Too many forks, too many rules." Something about her honesty amused him. He wasn't accustomed to people speaking so freely in his presence. Most either sought to impress him or carefully measured their words, afraid of saying the wrong thing. Sylvie, however, seemed unaffected by the weight of his name. "Then forget the rules," he said simply. "Eat how you like." She laughed softly. "I don't think that's how this place works." "You'd be surprised," he said, his tone holding the faintest edge of intrigue. Their conversation flowed effortlessly from there. He found himself asking questions, real questions, ones he had never cared to ask anyone before. She spoke about her work, about the things that brought her joy, about the small moments in life that made her smile, and he listened, truly listened. It was unsettling in a way. He had spent years perfecting the art of keeping people at arm's length, yet here he was, drawn into a conversation that felt far too natural. At one point, she leaned forward slightly, her expression thoughtful. "You don't talk about yourself much," he considered her words. "There's not much to say." "I doubt that," she countered. "A man like you, there's always a story." A story. He hadn't thought about his own in a long time. His life had been a carefully curated series of decisions, each one pushing him further into the empire he had built. But when was the last time someone had asked about him as more than just the CEO of Lancaster Industries? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he watched her, the way her expression remained open, expectant, as if she genuinely wanted to know. It was a dangerous thing, this pull toward her. But for the first time in years, he didn't push it away. Yaron had never been one to linger on moments, but something about Sylvie made time slow in a way he wasn't accustomed to. As they left the restaurant, the city lights stretched out before them, glowing in the quiet hum of the evening. The air was crisp, carrying the distant sounds of traffic and laughter, yet somehow everything felt muted when he was with her. She walked beside him, her steps unhurried, her presence effortless. He had spent a lifetime surrounded by people who measured their words, who watched him carefully, waiting to gauge his mood before speaking. But Sylvie never hesitated. She didn't calculate her responses, didn't weigh her words as if they were currency. She simply existed, and that, more than anything, made her impossible to ignore. They reached the sleek black car waiting at the curb, the driver already holding the door open. Yaron motioned for her to step inside, but she hesitated, glancing up at him with something unreadable in her gaze. "I can walk from here," she said, soft but certain, his brow furrowed. No one ever turned down an offer from him, especially when it came to convenience. "It's late," she smiled, and for the 1,000th time that night, something in him shifted. "I like walking at night. Clears my head." He should have let her go. He could have simply nodded, stepped into his car, and watched her disappear into the city. But instead, he found himself saying something that surprised even him. "Then I'll walk with you," she blinked, clearly not expecting it. But she didn't decline, and that was enough. They moved through the streets, weaving past quiet cafes and dimly lit storefronts, their conversation meandering between topics as naturally as the breeze that followed them. At one point, she glanced sideways at him, curiosity flickering in her gaze. "Do you ever do this?" "Do what?" "Just be," she gestured vaguely around them. "No meetings, no schedules, no people waiting on you, just walking, existing." No one had ever asked him that before. "No," he admitted. "Not in a long time," she hummed thoughtfully, as if the answer didn't surprise her. "That's a shame," he exhaled, looking ahead. "I don't have the luxury. Maybe you should make it." There was no judgment in her voice, just a quiet certainty, as if the idea of choosing freedom was as simple as breathing. He didn't answer, but the thought lingered. When they reached her apartment building, she turned to face him, arms tucked into her coat. "Thank you for dinner." He had never found himself at a loss for words, but standing there, watching her under the soft glow of the streetlight, he struggled to articulate what he wanted to say. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulling out the ring she had found. She tilted her head, eyes flicking to the small band before meeting his gaze again. "This belonged to my grandmother," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "She used to say that the most valuable things in life are never the ones you expect." Sylvie studied him, something unreadable in her expression. I think she was right. A beat of silence stretched between them, heavy with something unspoken. Then, without thinking, without calculating, he reached for her hand. It was small in his, warm against his palm. She didn't pull away. "I don't usually do this," he admitted, his voice lower now, the vulnerability foreign to him. Her lips parted slightly, her breath visible in the cold air. "Do what?" "This." His fingers tightened around hers just enough to anchor the moment. "Want something I didn't plan for." A soft exhale left her, her eyes searching his face. "Maybe that's a good thing." He had spent years building walls, ensuring nothing could shake the foundation he had constructed around himself. But with Sylvie, those walls didn't seem so impenetrable. And as she stepped closer, as the space between them vanished, he knew with absolute certainty he wasn't going to let her go. Yaren had spent years mastering control. Every decision he made was calculated, every move deliberate. His world was built on precision, on knowing the outcome before the first step was ever taken. And yet, standing outside Sylvie's apartment, her hand in his, he realized he had no idea what came next. She tilted her head slightly, studying him with a quiet intensity that made his pulse shift. There was no expectation in her gaze, no carefully crafted agenda. She wasn't trying to impress him, wasn't maneuvering herself into his life the way so many had before. That, more than anything, made her dangerous. He had always been able to anticipate people, to read their intentions before they ever voiced them. But Sylvie wasn't a variable he could predict. She was something entirely different, unaffected by the weight of his name, unshaken by the world he commanded. And perhaps that was why he hadn't let go of her hand yet. The city hummed around them, the distant sound of traffic a quiet reminder of the world beyond this moment. He should have stepped back, should have thanked her for the evening and walked away. That was the logical choice. The expected choice. Instead, he exhaled slowly and did something he never did. He allowed himself a moment of uncertainty. Sylvie, for her part, didn't press him for answers he hadn't yet found. She simply squeezed his hand once before pulling away, her expression unreadable. "I should go inside," she said, her voice softer now, as if acknowledging the shift between them. He nodded, but didn't move. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, then gave him a look he couldn't quite decipher before turning toward the entrance of her building. He watched her leave, his chest tightening in a way that was unfamiliar and unwelcome. The moment she disappeared behind the door, he exhaled sharply and turned on his heel, making his way back toward the waiting car. His driver didn't ask questions, he never did, but Yaron could feel the weight of his own thoughts pressing down as the city blurred past the tinted windows. He had spent years ensuring his life was free of distractions, that nothing could pull him off course. But Sylvie wasn't a distraction. No, she was something far worse. She was a possibility, and that was far more dangerous than anything he had ever encountered before. The next morning, Yaron sat in his office, staring at the reports in front of him without actually reading a single word. His assistant entered, placing a fresh cup of coffee on his desk. Normally, he would have acknowledged the gesture with a nod, but his mind was elsewhere. He had thought that after a night's rest, the unease in his chest would settle. That the pull towards Sylvie would fade into the background, buried beneath the usual demands of his day. It hadn't. If anything, it had only solidified. The memory of her laughter, the way she had challenged him without hesitation, the way she had made him question things he had never questioned before, it all lingered, stubbornly refusing to be pushed aside. He wasn't a man who entertained distractions. He had built an empire by staying focused, by ensuring that nothing, no one could disrupt the carefully constructed balance of his life. And yet, here he was, unable to think of anything else. A sharp knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. His assistant stepped inside again, her expression carefully neutral. "Sir, there's someone here to see you," he frowned. "I don't have any meetings scheduled," she insisted. Before he could respond, the door opened further and Sylvie stepped inside. Something in his chest shifted at the sight of her, unannounced, unexpected, and completely unaffected by the weight of the office surrounding her. His assistant hesitated, as if waiting for confirmation that this was acceptable. Yaron gave a subtle nod and she slipped out, leaving them alone. Sylvie, for her part, didn't seem the least bit intimidated by the towering glass walls, the sleek furniture, or the sheer power this room represented. Instead, she crossed her arms and met his gaze head-on. "I wasn't sure if you'd actually call," she said finally. He leaned back in his chair, watching her carefully. "And yet, you're here," she exhaled, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "Yeah, I guess I am." For the first time in a long time, Yaron Lancaster found himself abandoning logic entirely. Because for the first time, logic didn't matter. What mattered was the woman standing in front of him. The woman who had taken his coat by accident, the woman who had unknowingly stolen something far more valuable in the process, his heart. Yaron studied Sylvie from behind his desk, the energy in the room shifting with her presence. She had come to him, unprompted, unafraid. Few people did that. Fewer still held his attention the way she did. He gestured toward the chair across from him, and she hesitated only slightly before sitting. Her gaze never wavered, her confidence unwavering in a way that fascinated him. She exhaled, tilting her head slightly as if weighing her words. He had a feeling she was about to say something he wouldn't expect. "I thought about last night," she said finally. "And I realized something." He leaned forward slightly, intrigued despite himself. "I like my life," she continued. "It's simple, it's mine, but then I met you, and now—" She trailed off, her fingers tapping lightly against the arm of the chair. "You make things complicated." Yaron had spent years refining his ability to predict people's motives, to anticipate their next move before they even realized what they wanted. But with Sylvie, he had no such advantage. He considered her words carefully before responding. "Is that a bad thing?" She let out a soft breath, somewhere between exasperation and amusement. "I don't know yet." For a moment, silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was charged, full of something unspoken, something neither of them had quite figured out how to name. Finally, Yaron stood, moving around the desk. He didn't touch her, didn't crowd her, but he was close enough that when he spoke, his voice was lower, more deliberate. "I don't do complications," he admitted. "But I'm not willing to walk away from this." Sylvie's lips parted slightly, and for the first time since stepping into his office, uncertainty flickered across her face. Not fear, not hesitation, but the awareness that whatever this was, it wasn't something either of them could ignore. She looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "So what happens now?" He didn't have an answer. not one that fit within the structured world he had built for himself, but for once he was willing to figure it out as they went. Without breaking eye contact, he made a decision he never would have made with anyone else. "Come with me," he said, her brow arched slightly. "Where? You'll see." The drive was quiet, not with discomfort, but with anticipation. Sylvie sat beside him in the back of the car, her fingers resting lightly in her lap, her expression thoughtful as she watched the city pass by. She didn't ask where they were going again, and he appreciated that about her. She wasn't the type to demand answers before they were ready to be given. When they finally arrived, he stepped out first, offering his hand. She hesitated for only a second before taking it. The building before them was nothing like the grand restaurants or exclusive venues he usually frequented. It was older, more understated, but still carried a quiet elegance. Sylvie glanced at him as they entered. "This isn't what I expected." "That's the point," he said simply. Inside, the space was warm, inviting. A collection of paintings lined the walls, each one telling a different story. An older man greeted them with a knowing nod, leading them toward a private room in the back. Sylvie turned to him, curiosity flickering in her gaze. "What is this place?" "A gallery," he said. "But not the kind that makes the papers." She studied him for a long moment before realization dawned. "You own this, don't you?" "Not officially." She let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "Of course." They moved through the space, her eyes drifting over the paintings, taking in every detail. He watched her, noting the way she absorbed everything around her, how she didn't just glance at the art, but truly saw it. Finally, she turned to him. "Why did you bring me here?" Yaron exhaled slowly, considering his answer. "Because this is one of the only places where I don't have to be anything other than myself." It was the closest he had ever come to admitting vulnerability, and judging by the way her expression softened, she knew it too. She took a step closer. "I like this side of you." He held her gaze, his voice quieter now. "I like who I am when I'm with you." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, without thinking, without calculating, he reached for her. And for the first time in his life, Yaron Lancaster let himself feel something without hesitation. Weeks passed, and their lives became intertwined in a way that neither of them had planned. Sylvie challenged him in ways no one else ever had, and he found himself craving her presence more than he had ever thought possible. They didn't fit in the conventional sense, but that was what made it work. One evening, as they stood on the rooftop of his penthouse, the city stretching out below them, Yaron made a decision he had never thought he would make. He turned to her, reaching into his pocket and pulling out the ring that had started everything. She looked at him, eyes widening slightly. Yaron, he didn't give her a speech, he didn't make grand declarations that felt rehearsed. Instead, he simply said, "Marry me." Sylvie let out a soft breath, emotion flickering across her face. Then, without hesitation, she nodded. Yes, the word settled something deep inside him. He slid the ring onto her finger, and for the first time in his life, Yaron Lancaster felt completely, undeniably whole. The wedding was private, intimate. No press, no extravagant guest lists. Just them, a handful of people who mattered, and a promise that neither of them had ever expected to make. As they stood together, the vows spoken, the future unfolding before them, Yaron realized something. For years, he had built his life around control, around ensuring that nothing unexpected could shake him. But Sylvie had been the one exception to every rule he had ever created, and he wouldn't have it any other way. As they walked hand in hand, the world waiting beyond them, he looked at the woman who had changed everything. And he knew with absolute certainty that he would never let her go.